Go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. This is the FileMaker Pro 18 Advanced under the hood. I'm Daniel, so I'm going to get things started. But while we're settling in, quick surveys. By a show of hands, when did everyone start using FileMaker? Within the last year? OK, hand or two. Within the last 5 years? OK, a couple more. Within the last 10 years? OK, good, a few more. Within the last 20 years? OK,
Wow.
OK, quite a bit more. OK, more than the last 20 years. OK, great, yeah, OK, right, thank you. OK, next question. Which platform do you guys develop and deploy onto? Mac OS only? OK, a couple people. Windows only? OK, a couple people also. Both? OK, vast majority. OK, thanks everyone. So let's kick things off. The agenda for today, first we're going to start off with account and plugin security. We're going to move on to record importing, continuing on to calc functions and script steps. Then we're going to talk about the future of XML, and then we'll end off with a Q&A. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time for that. So you may be wondering who exactly we are. Like I said, I'm Daniel. I started using a related product, ClarisWorks, that came pre-installed on a Mac that my family had. It had a database product. Back then, we were called Claris. Thank you. So joining me on stage is Clay Mackel. He's the chief software architect, and basically what that means is he's involved in every project here at FileMaker. And also with us today is Wes Powell. Despite what it says in his speaker's bio, he is in fact the director of client engineering, and that means he's in charge of all clients. That's Pro, Go, and WebDirect. OK, so you'll notice that all of us are on the development staff. I also wanted to acknowledge the work done on the features that we're going to show you today by not just other developers, but other disciplines as well. And that means test, program management, design, information development, and localization. So there are a lot of people that put their time and effort into what we're going to show you today, and it takes a large team. OK, so let's start by talking about account security as of Pro version 17. So you may recall, if you're familiar with this, we had two modes, basic and a detailed mode. And you basically had to choose which one you wanted. And I think we started you off with basic, but anytime you needed to do anything different, you switched into detailed view, and you had a different account experience, as well as privilege sets, extended privileges, and file access. So what we wanted to do is, for Pro version 18, we wanted to see if we could take the ease of use from the basic mode and combine it with the power and flexibility of the detailed mode. So this is what we came up with. You'll notice we kept the two different versions. We have the main managed security dialog that you see on the left now, as well as the other things that you could do security related in advanced security. And where we ended up with is this advanced security is now a sub-dialog of the main managed security dialog. So we're going to get into that a little bit later. But what we ended up with is what we like, and it presents a clearer separation of who you're giving access to in your particular file versus what they can do with that access. And so we liked how that split up very much, and you can give us your feedback and how you feel once you get started using it. But let's dive deeper now into account security, and you'll notice the main part of the screen in the main managed security dialog is taken up with the access control list. And what we've given you here is the ability to inline set the privilege sets assignment and enable and disable accounts. And the other thing you can do here is drag and drop. We made that a little bit easier to do. Previously, I think you had to have a very focused target area to drag and drop. And then also, you'll use that to reorder your priorities just as before. So if you recall how this works, we haven't changed the basic meaning of the priority order. But basically, you need to get your accounts in order, because that's the order that we're going to use to authenticate you with. So basically, the first match will be the privilege set that they will use going into the file. And so that comes into play if you perhaps have overlapping groups. So if a user is a member of 2 different groups and both groups are in the access control list with 2 different access control entries, the first match that they're a member of will be their privilege set assignment. OK, great. The other thing we did is we gave you guys multi-select. And that will allow you to set your privilege sets across multiple access control entries and also enable and disable groups, multiple rows in your table. So no one told us to do it. We just kind of did it. So we hope you guys will like it. It's a little bit more powerful, presents a little bit of flexibility, but it's a little bit harder to discover. You kind of have to try it, see if it works. The other thing you'll notice on this screenshot that I provided is the right-hand side. That's the details pane on the right. And this will basically, when you've singly selected a single entry, this will give you access to all the settings that you can do on your account entry. And so that'll be contextual. So based on the type of the account, it'll adapt based on what's available. So we think this is a little bit more extensible, a little bit more forward-looking in its design, and this will serve us well in the future. So the next thing I want to cover is account types. So a little bit of background first on open authorization. So you may hear OAuth thrown around a lot. This is what we mean. So just a little bit of a review to make sure we're all on the same page. OAuth is an open standard for authorizing users. And how that breaks down is the authentication is delegated to the OAuth provider. So the OAuth provider will make sure that the username and password matches so that they are who they say they are. The server administrator will configure OAuth on the server. So if you've got someone in charge of your server, they'll need to do a little bit of configuration to set up OAuth. But once that happens, then the security admin will authorize users for each solution file. So they're going to give access to whoever they feel needs access. And now we'll talk about who exactly is this security admin a little bit later on. But you can imagine someone, for example, having full access to your solution file. They're going to be using managed security and setting everyone up with their access. And the other thing that's a little bit different is users will manage their own passwords. So they'll maintain this relationship with the OAuth provider, and they're going to, if they need to change the password, they're going to go to the OAuth provider to do that. For example, a lot of these OAuth providers have websites where they can manage their own accounts. And so that means the solution developer no longer has to be in charge of things like managing users' passwords. So we think that'll work out better. This is an industry standard that the industry is moving towards. So we like to encourage that. The other thing is it also helps out users because the same username and password will work across multiple solution files. That means the users don't have different usernames and passwords across for each solution file that they have access to. And what that means is that if they update a password in one that they have access to one solution file, that means it'll be updated everywhere. So it's also a little bit easier to manage for users as well. And the other thing is this has been supported since version 16. So it's not exactly new to 18, but you'll see that on the details view, I included a zoomed-in screenshot. So we have options for you to configure that are new as well. So let's talk a little bit more about how else this might affect the managed security. So the filter categories, you'll notice at the top, we have the FileMaker file or external server. So that's the first category that you see up here. And then each OAuth provider will be an entry in this selector as well. So in the screenshot, you'll see Amazon, Google, Microsoft Azure AD. And so we select, you can select which one, and that'll filter basically what you see in the main access control list. So how many people are using OAuth today? Show of hands. OK, a couple people. How many people use more than one OAuth provider? More than one? OK, a few people. Yeah, so let us know what you think of that, and come back to us after the session. And so how we chose these categories were based on the information that's available at the login dialog. So you remember when users are logging into their solution file, they either type in their username and password, or they choose a specific OAuth provider. So that's the information that we have, and that ties in with these categories here. So that means that you won't ever have, for example, users from one OAuth provider ever being confused with users with a different OAuth provider. So if you've got more than one, talk to us. Let us know how that works out. OK, next, let's talk about lockout verification. So users are going to be prompted to save changes whenever you retain, to ensure that you retain access. So that's kind of to make sure that people don't lock themselves out accidentally. And this allows us to streamline multiple credential prompts that were related to managed security. So hopefully that'll be a little bit easier for everyone. And our security model is more consistent with the rest of the FileMaker platform, as well as Mac OS and Windows. So streamlining it actually brings us closer aligned with the platform. So I mean, the team has thought long and hard about this. We've got external validation of the security implications from outside people. So we feel good about where we are. And but I am here to say, though, please do not leave your computer unlocked after you log in. If you can't trust your physical environment, that's just a tip. OK, thanks. So the commit model. So you remember that previously in 17, you had the basic and the detailed view, and you had to commit before switching to make sure that the two views were in sync. We decided to take another look at that. And where we ended up with is the advanced security commit model. Remember the advanced security dialog, the sub-dialog? That will now include uncommitted changes from the main managed security dialog, the one with the accounts. And so that means that when you click OK on the advanced security dialog, your changes will be saved immediately, and those will be written out. So that means that canceling back on the main advanced dialog will retain the changes that you made in advanced. So that means that whatever dialog you're looking at, clicking OK will be committed, despite what you may do on the parent dialog. So the reason why we took another look at that is because of the relationship changes between these two dialogues. And so we think that these interactions made the most sense. I think the team went back and forth a little bit on this while we were developing. So where we landed, we feel pretty good. But let us know if you have thoughts. We're always open. We're here the rest of the week at DevCon. And the last thing for my time up here is going to be about this privilege for managing account security. So remember earlier I talked about this security admin. Well, we introduced a new privilege, so it's not necessarily everyone who just the people who have full access. And so we called this manage accounts that don't have full access. So that means if you have this new privilege, it's going to give you a limited ability to manage user accounts. And so you might want to consider setting this alongside the available menu commands that you see at the bottom on the right-hand side. You might want to set that to all. And that'll give you the UI to open manage security. And the reason why we made these two different settings is because we really felt that there was a clear separation between these two. For example, you may just want to give access to people to manage security through script steps, for example, as opposed to accessing it and showing it through the UI. So this is just one thing to be aware of if you're going to use that. And this was a much requested feature, and it allows you to delegate your day-to-day account management without necessarily giving access to these people to your layouts, to your scripts, things like that. So let us know what you guys think about that, and hopefully you enjoy it. Well, that's my time for today. Thank you very much. I'm going to now introduce Clay back up here, and he's going to kick us off with plugin security. Clay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't really know what the company name was going to be this morning, so I brought my Apple hat, I brought my FileMaker hat, and actually I have my Claris hat here, so I guess I'll put this back on. So. Not quite the right logo. I mean, Wes is more up to date than me, but I'm older. So we're continuing on the security topics. I'm going to be talking about changes with plugins and some of the security issues that have been coming up there, about how unsigned plugins are still supported, issues with the FileMaker server, and the get function. So the first thing is that, how many people here know what digital signatures are? Okay, most of you and stuff like that. So people sign email messages, you can sign code, you can almost sign anything. It basically gives you a way to prove that this digital object on your machine came from a particular person, and it uses RSA, private and public keys, and you go to conferences all about that stuff. Apple is pushing us to do a lot more security issues and stuff like that. Security is almost like job one at Apple now, and not just firing people who leak secrets either. So we're going through, and we noticed that our plugins, we never really verified who the plugin came from or whether it was actually modified by someone else. So now we've been requesting for the last 2 years. I've been telling the plugin vendors to sign their plugins. Not everyone has done it yet. Most of them have. But we now do checks, very much like how when you talk to an SSL host. So SSL uses the same techniques to guarantee that the host you're talking to is the host that's owned by that company. And we now have the little lock icons and come up on the windows that show whether it's green, yellow, or gray, or what state it's in. So it's a very similar process for plugins now. If a plugin is unsigned and you launch FileMaker, you're going to come up with this new dialog up here saying that this plugin comes from an unidentified developer. You're given a choice to go ahead and load the plugin, don't load the plugin, and much like with SSL certificates for network, you have a choice to remember that, oh, I trust this plugin, don't ask me again in the future. If you do get this dialog, make sure to talk to your plugin vendor to update their plugins, or maybe all you're doing is running an old plugin. Most likely the vendor has a new one that you can download that is already signed, and that'll probably solve, and none of your users will see this anymore. If you do check that checkbox, we've renamed what used to be the permitted host tab to just permitted under the preferences dialog box. I'm not sure how many people know that this is where the list of hosts from that you've connected to that have bad certificates ends up being in there. And there's a clear all button if you want to reset all to forget that you've permitted all these objects. But what will show up now is plugins will show up in this list too. It's always going to end with the .fm plugin extension, even though that the plugin may not have that extension at the end. It's one way to tell the difference between hosts and plugins that are in this list. Only unsigned plugins can have this exception. We're not going to allow plugins that have certificates that are expired, revoked, or just incorrect. Those are really error conditions, and there's really something wrong with the plugin at that point, so we're not going to load it. We do give you the exception if it's not signed at all to go ahead and load the plugin. And then on server, we made this decision that plugins actually have to be signed. We're not going to load unsigned plugins. Especially with things in the cloud and stuff like that, we decided to really crank up the security for this and be more secure in that case. So there's no exceptions. Well, there's an exception. Linux, so Mac so the Mac environment and the Windows environments have this whole ecosystem to sign stuff. There's places that you buy the certificates from or you get them. Linux doesn't really have there are some standards out there, but like other things, the great thing about standards is that there's so many to choose from. We've talked about maybe hooking into Apple's system too or not, but at this point, we don't require plugins for the cloud version running on AWS to be required to be signed. If you write your own plugin, is there any people here that write their own plugins? Okay, a couple, okay. Here, these slides will be able to be downloaded. Some of my slides are pretty dense coming up, so don't worry about writing this stuff down. You'll be able to download this and get it. But here's 2 URLs to describe how to sign your plugins and VM. And if someone out here has a plugin from a vendor that longer exists, or the person that wrote it passed away, or for some reason you can't get a signed version officially, you can actually go through this process, buy a certificate, and sign the plugin with your company's name or with your identity and stuff like that. This may break, if you have a EULA from that plugin that said you're not supposed to do that, that may be breaking the EULA, but if they're gone and don't exist anymore, it'd be hard to enforce that. But I'm not a lawyer, so probably talk to a lawyer before you do this. But if you really need to get your solution up and running, that's why I didn't put it in text on the slide, so I don't know if I can edit the voice afterwards. And then there's a new last external error details. So when you load a plugin, there's a script step called install plugin, something like that. And it previously only returned 2 errors, error 1550 and 1551, and that's the text of the error from the help file. But there's usually a whole bunch of different reasons why a plugin couldn't load. And you probably can't read it here, but you'll be able to get the slide and read all the different reasons why it happens. But you could either pop up a dialog or give the user a reason why it couldn't load it, or you may figure out, why it's unsigned or why it couldn't load it. Maybe the package got corrupted. There's a little picture of a script to the right. Later on, you can see this is the script I wrote to display that alert on the top there. So this is stuff you can look at later. But we did extend, and this is going to be kind of in general for this last external error detail. As you come within new technologies, it first started out with only SQL statement errors that would come back through there, and then we added OpenSS or SSL certificate error messages come back in here. This is kind of the dumping area for giving you better error messages coming back from different technologies that are underneath, instead of just getting 1550 and not knowing really the sub-reason why it failed. So this is the next thing that we added in 18 for this function. Next time we go to record importing. So this is one of the big features of 18. We redid the UI for it. I'm not going to really talk about the UI changes, what happened up there. Instead, I'm going to be talking about 3 of the main changes that occurred under the hood for this. So the 3 features of that is the field names, being able to choose what row you want for the field names, custom delimiters, and being able to have finer control over auto-enter fields. So previously inside FileMaker, we would only store a Boolean basically saying, use the first row for field names or do not use it for field names. And the lowest level code that actually did the real work always looked at that bool, and then the UI would allow you to enable it or disable it depending on which file filter that it was picked, whether it was text or merge. Like merge, you couldn't turn it off, and there's a whole bunch of complex conditions underneath there. But and previously it would only say 2 to ... and stuff like that, but there's always been a limit of 500 records in the preview. So the preview has changed a couple times in the past in the import dialog, so you can still only preview to 500. We didn't change that, but now the UI says 500 plus if there's more than 500 records in the preview. And in my previous talks, I've talked about how the file format is this big B tree of name-value pairs. And what we do when we add new features like this is that we basically store this new information, this new number that we have to store instead of a bool, in one of these new nodes. So when you save an import script step, there's a new node in the file format that was unused that the previous product just ignores because it doesn't know to read that name-value pair. So it just doesn't know about it. And in that new node is the options for these 3 new features, or these 3 new extensions to the import dialog. Now we tried to go through and set reasonable values in the old location where that bool was set. So if you go through and say pick any row number to be the first row, or the row to pick the field names from, we'll set the bool to true. So if you go back from 18 with this set to I want to read row 3, it's going to just read row 1 because it doesn't know where the number is to look it up. But it will try to read row 1. So if you are using this feature and you're moving back to older versions, you're going to have a different behavior. You may want to use the other features to limit which version of FileMaker can open this file. So you do have to worry about when you're going backward, using older versions of FileMaker when using new features like this. But we try to pick reasonable values. So if you say, don't use any row for the field name, that's going to work perfectly in older versions because we set the bool to false. And similar for the custom delimiter. Actually, the low-level code has always had a value that could be customized underneath it, just the UI never gave you a choice for it. So, and where it was stored wasn't quite handy, so it's actually in this new node also where we store it. We renamed tab-separated values to custom-separated values now, since you can specify the character. But we are limited to basic multilingual plain characters in Unicode. We could give a whole talk on just Unicode. You could go on days just talking about that, not mess, but it did make things slightly better than what like in the 80s. But you can't use any characters from the supplemental plane. So you can't use a character like my cowboy emoji here. Because a lot of the new emoji characters, a lot of new Chinese characters, Klingon, sorry, you can't use Klingon punctuation marks as your character delimiters. Those all characters are in the supplemental planes, and they take up more than 16 bits. They take 2 UTF-16 characters to represent. And the low-level code that goes through scanning, trying to find delimiters and stuff like that can only handle one 16-bit value at this point. We may change that in the future, but I'm not quite sure if there's going to be much need. I don't know how many people are going to use Klingon comma characters to separate their import. And then there's auto-enter per field setting. This one is a little bit more complex because it's not a simple bool or a simple ordinal or character code point. So the first time you edit an import dialog and it comes up here, we'll save in this new structure, in this new node location, the list of all the fields that have auto-enter option turned on. And you can turn them on and off. And to be backward compatible, if you turn them all off, we turn the option off for older versions. If you turn any of them on or all of them on in older versions of FileMaker 17 and before, you'll see the option set to enable all auto-enter. So this is yet another. So this is a little bit more worrisome because there's more issues to worry about. Because this could really affect your solutions drastically, depending if someone uses an old version of a 17 and you've set up this import process where the new fields have to have new goods entered, but you don't want to change the modification date or the creation date because that's user information that isn't new. You're just bringing over data. So you have to be careful when you're dealing with import and making sure that you're using the correct version of FileMaker. And this is also true for when adding a new field to a table. So let's say you set up an import. It has these 5 auto-enter things. You add a new auto-enter field in defined databases or managed databases. So what will the import code do? Will it be on or off when you add a new field? But right now, the choice, what happens now is if all the fields are off, we kind of run in the backward compatibility mode. We have the bool set, don't do any auto-enter. So an auto-enter field entered into a table will be off. But if any field is turned on for auto-enter, any new field added to a table, the auto-enter will be enabled for that import operation. And depending on how you have things set up, most likely you won't have a field hooked up to it, but if you're going through and just clicking things on, you'll definitely want to look at this pop-up when new fields have been added to your table and make sure you specify which way it should be, whether it should be on or off for that field. So these are some gotchas when making changes now that there's this other place of a list of fields that are in there. It's not just, previously you had to worry about auto-enter order, just the order of import in general when new fields came in and stuff like that. But now you have to also worry about the auto-enter choice. You talk about some of the new calculation functions. There's 3 different areas here. I'm not going to go too much into while. There's a bunch of different talks coming up. There's the Todd Weller session, Let It Go for a While. He's talking about let and while in there. So he's going to show you how to use that. There's Wim's article about scoping of variables inside calculations. And this has always been true, but very few people ever put let statements inside other let statements. But now that you have while and let, people have been putting while statements inside let statements and let statements inside as sub-expressions inside while statements. And scoping becomes a bit more complex, and Wim does a pretty good job of explaining how that works in there. The safest thing is just don't reuse variable names. Don't try to use the variable x in all the different levels of your functions. If you give everything a different name, you're usually much safer that way. And even C++ compilers now start giving you warnings if you hide variables with other variables with the same name. Even though the scoping will work, it's just a hard thing to remember and saying, oh, wait, is this X my X from my case statement, or is this an X from this let that's internally underneath there? It's best to give everything a different name and a usable name that you know and you can understand. But for how while is actually implemented, it really is just a let statement. As it goes through and is executing the let statement, it'll hit a condition, and then it basically just unwinds the calculation back up, leaving the values of properly scoped variables the way they were, and then just keeps repeating. So it just basically, as it's going along, executing the calc, it backs up and just keeps going forward until the condition is hit, and then it continues, returns the results, and go on. It's actually a lot more complex with that if you know reverse Polish notation. If you really liked HP calculators back in the 80s, I don't know how many people used the old HP calculators and actually understood how it worked. So that, if you understand that, you understand how our calc engine works. The other big change with this was set recursion. Previously, this has been topics of other long talks here at DEF CON, is about tail recursion and non-tail recursion. With tail recursion, you could go like 50,000 iterations. With non-tail recursion, you only had 10,000 iterations. And we wanted to have a similar limit for while so that you didn't get into infinite loops. So we've kind of all normalized this, that the number of iterations is 50,000 by default for everything. Any type of, you don't have to worry about tail recursion, non-tail recursion. You don't have to worry about that to affect how many iterations you can go through. While loops are limited to 50,000, but you can use the new set recursion function. It works very much like the set precision. Set precision, when you bump the precision up from the default, I think it's 18 right now, you can go up to 400 digits of precision in the calc engine if you want. But that only applies to everything that's inside that first expression. So set recursion works the same way. That expression, that first expression, any whiles that are inside there or any custom functions that do recursion inside there will have the max number of iterations that you specify in the second parameter. And lastly, I'm running late. Well, these are pretty simple. These new get functions, we have a count type. As Daniel was showing you, there's the pop-up. So it'll tell you which of those pop-up menu items are at the top. Well, guest is a special case. And this list will be growing over time in the next year. How many do we have any Apple employees, Apple corporate employees in here? Okay, there's one back there. They'll actually see another choice in there because we're testing things out using some of the Apple internal stuff, which Apple won't let us release outside the world, but it's how we're testing these other OAuth things and stuff like that. So we do have some customers testing this stuff out. Get open data file info. Wes will be talking about the new script steps to do this, but this is another function that will return the files that are currently opened by that file. And lastly, there's these new calculation functions. There's not too much to say. If you use the base elements versions or the monkey bread versions of this, this basically does the same functionality. It's you can much like I've been talking about signing plugins and how you sign host sites and stuff like that. You can now sign, images or sign text, and this is how secure mail is usually done on the internet. If you have a mail product that allows you to sign it, it's using a private key to generate a signature chunk of text that guarantees that that message came from that person. So now you can add this in with like our new curl support for SMTP and other stuff like that if you want to send, quote, secure mail using these certificates. Well, it is secure, as much as SMTP is secure. And you can't see these here, but if you go look at it, you can see how the monkey bread base elements and the new FileMaker versions, these are all equivalent commands basically up here, and the syntax is a little bit different. The plugins tend to add a lot more parameters. For FileMaker, when we're writing our calcs, we tend to separate operations out into separate calculations. So like you take the output from the crypt generate signature, and you can either run it through the base64 encoder function or the hex encoder function, or whichever encoding you want for the output of that, how you want to store it. Where in the plugins from the plugin vendors, it's usually an option in there instead of another function. It's just kind of a different design philosophy of how to write calculations. And the other thing is that we've moved to OpenSSL 1.1.1 in 18v2. So we're using the latest version of OpenSSL. This has caused some other issues and changes. The new version of OpenSSL has dropped some cryptography ciphers that are in there. Like in that option up there, I'm showing that we're using SHA-512 up there. There's an option that you could just type SHA by itself, which was like SHA-0. It was the original SHA. OpenSSL no longer supports that cipher, because it's actually even worse than MD5. It has a bunch of security flaws in it. It is fast, but it's very flawed, and everyone never recommended using it. And we probably shouldn't have ever added it into FileMaker in the first place. So now if you ever try to use just the straight SHA cipher, you're going to get an error. You're going to get a question mark coming back from the function because OpenSSL doesn't support it, and I didn't want to write an implementation for something that you shouldn't be using anyway. And I guess the last thing, there's the verify signatures. This is basically exactly it's just the opposite side of this. This is the example of how to write, how the plugins did the verification of the signature. So when you receive the email, you can verify that the contents of the email or the text or the JPEG or whatever you signed matches the signature that came along with it. And I'm going to hand it over to Wes, who's going to go on to more script steps.
All right. Thanks, Clay and Daniel. So I'll try to get through my slides to make sure we leave plenty of time for Q&A. I think our session's scheduled to end at noon, but I'm guessing with how many people we have in the audience and with Clay and Daniel on stage, we'll get a lot of questions. But real quick, I wanted to highlight a lot of the new script steps we've introduced in FileMaker 18, and then I'm going to transition and give you some details about the inner workings of our new XML representation. So first off, I'm going to highlight and go through a couple slides for the script steps that manipulate file I/O. Under the hood, these script steps actually use the same file class as our database engine. The underlying file handling code has been in use a long time internally, but now we've exposed it via script steps and calculations. And in fact, from the coding point of view, we're leveraging FileMaker's cross-platform abstraction on many of the C++ standard file I/O library functions. So in summation, these are very powerful. And I did want to call out a bit of our vocabulary. For these script steps, we use the phrase data file, and that's to differentiate from open file, which is always in the context of a FileMaker file, such as FMP12 extension. So when you hear data file, think of every file except for FileMaker file. And some of the powerful use cases we anticipate developers using these script steps for are logging operations, such as when a user edits a field or a record, you could log some output. Custom export logic, you could write out record data using JSON or your own proprietary format. And then also to streamline imports, scripted imports, you could manipulate the CSV file and put user-friendly field names on top. So let me highlight how we could do that. First off, I want to talk about creating and deleting a file. Something to call out here, file manipulation requires a pair of open and close operations. And this is because when you perform a file open, FileMaker will call into the operating system's file system and grab an exclusive read-write lock to make sure nobody else can manipulate that file. So when you have that lock, you need to make sure you signal to the operating system when you want to release the lock, and you do so with a close operation. I'll mention that a couple times through some examples. So manipulating files, very easy. First off, you'll specify a file path to create, and you'll be prompted with the traditional FileMaker file dialog, very familiar there. And I do want to mention server-side scripting does enforce the sandbox behavior of the documents folder or the temporary folder. So if you're doing server-side scripting using the file I/O script steps, you can't browse through a server, grab all its data, and send it back to the clients. We constrain that. Desktop client-side scripting, however, you have full access to the user's hard drive, so be careful there. And as always, FMGO adheres to the iOS sandbox, so you'll be limited to the application's documents folder. When you go and create a file, you also have an option to create all folders where that file will live. And I want to call out, it will clobber an existing file. So to avoid a clobber, we have a new script step called getFileExist. So you can check that condition, will return a Boolean, and then you can proceed forward or append data, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So you open a file. Our system allows 25 maximum opened files, which is a lot to juggle. And when you open a file, you'll be returned a file ID, which you can assign to a variable or a field. This file ID, think of it as a convenient handle. So when you're editing or reading files, you just pass in the file ID. You don't have to constantly put in the file path itself, so it'll make your scripting more robust. And once you're done closing a file, you'll pass in that handler, or you can just use the wildcard symbol and close all files. And we allow the ability to delete a file and rename a file. So let's talk about what it takes to read and write data. And to highlight how our database engine uses this file class, as you heard about the import dialog, anytime we go through and parse an Excel file or CSV file, we use these exact same C++ functions that are made available to you via scripting. So once you have a file open, you'll grab that exclusive read-write lock. If for some reason that fails because you have it open in another text editor, the script runtime will return you an error. Once that file is open, we set the read position at 0 bytes. So this is where you're going to make a decision on if you want to append to the end of the file by using the script step get file length, or if you want to insert something in the middle or at the beginning. So it's important to know the encoding of the file, whether it be UTF-8 or UTF-16. This will signal to FileMaker how many bytes to read in as it parses through. If you mess this up, it will result in garbage data. So kind of an edge case to be aware of. If you have a file with mixed encoding, be sure to coordinate that. When you write out to a file, to facilitate one of our primary use cases we envision, we do have a parameter to allow for appending a line feed. This way, when you're doing logging, FileMaker will automatically add a new line character, so you'll get clean carriage returns, so you don't have to worry about doing that yourself. Something I would love to hear feedback from is we have currently a 64 megabyte limit of how much data you can read and write in. If you need to exceed 64 megs, you have to include another script step. We put it at a cap just to prevent erroneous scripts or behavior from consuming all the hard drive space on your server or client machine. So if you think that's too low, let us know. We can always increase it. It's just a number. And I'd love to hear if there's any interest for folder support to create folders, delete folders, rename folders. That was easy. Robert's in the front row. I'm giving him eye contact right now, our product manager. So another very powerful script step we introduced was set error logging. This was a feature that we've talked with the community about for many years. In fact, it came onto my radar about 4 years ago. We've been actively discussing this among ourselves and with people active on the forum, so we're excited to finally deliver this. And the way it works is anytime a script's executing and it returns an error, we'll write it to a log file. So the primary use case here is it'll be a tool to help troubleshoot client errors. We give you a lot of possibilities of debugging server-side issues, but we wanted to make that more powerful on client. So this script step is available for Pro Advanced and Go at this time. And it'll follow all the same mechanisms as other logging, such as import and recover logs. So the file that will get outputted to the drive is scripterrors.log, and there's no backup or file size limit enforcement there. We leave it up to you to manage that. When this script step is enabled, the user must have full access, or the script must be running as full access. And the reason for that is we consider this script step a debugging feature because it's outputting such potentially sensitive data about your solution, intellectual property. We include parameters such as timestamp, session, account name, as you see there. And we also allow you as a developer to specify a calculation that will be appended to that output. And also the script step will only run on a per file basis. So when you're flipping it on and off, that'll be per the file because we don't want a rogue file being able to pull data from other external files. We want to lock that down. And now I want to give you some insight on XML representation. This might be a little dense. I'm going to go into some of the engineering behind it. But I did want to talk about the new FileMaker 18 feature, Save a Copy as XML. You'll see it under the Tools menu. So we first shipped this feature internally as part of FileMaker 17. The default fields leverage this, starter solutions and add-on tables, and I'll tell you the inner workings of those soon. And I want to give you some rationale about why we chose XML for the representation of a FileMaker file. There's a handful of reasons. First off, we wanted to choose XML because it will make the transition from DDR straightforward. We currently support DDR fully, but I'll go into the next slide and tell you where XML has a lot of advantages. So if you've written any tools to parse XML and DDR, those will all carry forward here. Also, XML is just more verbose and provides a lot more human-readable content. We encounter XML all the time in software engineering. For example, Interface Builder in Xcode uses XML to power their zip files. Visual Studio and XAML is all XML, so it seemed like a natural progression for FileMaker to continue to use XML. Having said that, we are exploring the possibilities of JSON. I mean, JSON's no stranger to us. We treat it as a first-class citizen. Clay's introduced a lot of the calcs there. And in fact, WebDirect uses JSON representations of layouts and layout objects to communicate across its layer. And if you're familiar with the Data API, or DAPI as we call it, it has a JSON representation. So we're exploring consolidation. So Save a Copy as XML is conceptually very different from DDR and the DDR HTML. Those existing features gave a pretty print version of the FileMaker file and would omit a lot of internal details. The new XML representation provides a complete output of a FileMaker file, and it will reveal all the internal values. So if you inspect it, you may see some cryptic bit fields, because that's just giving you everything we have in the database engine. Also, the use case for XML is to facilitate version control. This XML representation will play nicely with version control systems such as SVN or Git. Common use case we use internally is before you change a FileMaker file, you'll save a copy as XML, check it into source code, and any further changes you'll be able to diff against using a file diff tool, and you'll just have a catalog to audit all the changes that go along in your system. And by doing so, I would encourage you to consider this XML like your source code. And in fact, that's why Save a Copy as XML requires full access, because it's going to output the entire intellectual property of your file. Nothing is hidden, so be careful with it. So I'm going to dig a little into Q&A, but I'll go quickly here. I wanted to give you some insight on internal use, and you can do your best to read between the lines here on what I'm telling you. So internally, there's a big difference between DDR. We wanted the XML to be an input mechanism as well, and you can see that with the flow chart here. When we start with a FileMaker 12 file, XML pops out, and we can recreate with 100% fidelity that exact same FileMaker file. And in fact, we're using that for the starter solutions today. So conceptually, to illustrate this, our file format could be replaced by XML. However, we would never do that for the reasons Clay mentioned, because our proprietary B+ tree gives us a lot more performance than XML could ever hope to dream of. So again, this functionality is not publicly exposed, but it's used by a ton of features. And in fact, we have further enhancements to serialize out record data, and we do container data using base 64 encoding. So if you ever snoop around on your hard drive, you'll see some good stuff there. And speaking of which, I want to talk about how we localize XML as part of starter solutions. If you've ever tried to translate or localize a FileMaker solution, at the very least I would say it requires coordination, if that's a good enough word. And in FileMaker we support 11 languages. And so traditionally, we would have 11 different files for our sample apps for each language we should support. And we like to move quickly, we like to iterate, and that's just not scalable or maintainable. So if you ever poke around in the add-on tables portion of your hard drive, you'll see something like this data structure here. And what we do internally is we output the XML and we split all the user-defined strings into separate files. So I'm going to call it the schema XML, and then we have separate languages for each one. And what happens is when we deserialize this, we use a key value pair, and I'll show you a quick snippet of what that looks like, to map the schema with the user-defined strings so the end result is a fully translated file. And again, you can see this in practice with the product in market today. If you switch your operating system's language and create new starter files, all this machinery takes place. So how do we localize files quick and easily? We use something called base localization. So if you were to snoop into our strings files, you'll see something like this. That string ID is the key we use to match the strings file to the schema file. So during deserialization, we pull it all together. So in this example, we're trying to translate the phrase add address, and you can see the source text. At FileMaker, we use English as our development language, so that's all of our source text. We then hand it over to our translators, and here it's been translated to Chinese. We provide comments to let the translators know that this is part of a calculation. It gives them context to give the right phrasing. And with that key value pair, we can generate a full solution. And real quick, I'm going to skim over how we handle calculations. Calculations are a little bit interesting because our calc engine is looking for particular keywords, which you can see in the white text at the bottom, case, not, is, empty. And then the blue text are all the user-defined strings. And in this example, they happen to be coming from the contacts add-on table where the field name is last name. And field names in FileMaker are user-defined. So across multiple languages, we want to translate that English word into the 10 other languages we support. And that's kind of how this magic happens. And the quick shout out I'm going to give real quick is to our Universal Touch theme. It came out in FileMaker 17. If you haven't used it yet, I would encourage you to do so. It has a different approach to themes. I like to consider it 3 themes in one. There's like kind of a white, gray, and black theming mechanism to it, much more modern. It's been designed up front for mobile and touch, and it helped facilitate a lot of these translation efforts by avoiding truncation issues when you switch fonts across your layouts. So with that, we have officially 8 minutes left. And as a bit of a housekeeping, if you want your new fancy Clara shirt, be sure to go to check-in or reception. They're handing them out there. And then the microphone is right in the center if I can see through the lights. So if you have any questions for us, feel free to line up. And thank you.
Hello, first question. Given that we can now export the schema into XML, but the XML is used in many other major systems, is there any reason why you can't smile nicely at Robert and get us some native XML transformation functions, please?
I could smile at him. He's probably sick of my face, so it might do better if everybody else in the room does, but that does come up for conversation. Anything you wanted to mention, Clay?
Yeah, we've explored it and stuff like that. And, I don't know. Talk to Robert. That's going to be our default answers. Talk to him. But that's
yeah, great question. Next.
I have a question about the reason why external authentication is implemented the way it is. Let me use a simple example. 2 files, file 1 and 2, and each one has accounts representing 2 external authentication groups, A and B. So I open file 1, and I am a member of group B. And so I'm logged, I open file 1, and I am a member of group A. So I'm logged into file 1 with group A. Then when I do something in file 1 that triggers file 2 to open, let's say in file 2, the authentication order is reversed. I have group B before group A. But because I logged into file 1 with group A, even though group A is lower down in the authentication order in file 2, I'm still logged into file 2 using group A. My question is, why is it implemented that way, and why doesn't FileMaker check every time you open a file what all groups you're a member of in that file and logs you in with a higher authentication order?
it really should be working that way. I have to see your solution and see what's going on there.
Okay.
Because it doesn't happen for me, but I mean, which authentication method are you using?
Just a plain external authentication.
Yeah, but which, are you using Active Directory?
Active Directory.
Active Directory in the background?
You think it should be checking every time you open a file?
it gets a little weird because with Active Directory, we're passing around the packet, the security package that we got back from Active Directory, and I'm not quite sure how its matching mechanism is going to be working. I'd have to see.
Based on the experience with a client recently, it was working this way, and I checked with other people, and it seems to be implemented that way.
Okay, that's something we'll have to check in.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll look into it. Thanks.
I'll follow up with you later.
Okay.
Yeah, offline.
Hi, I have a security-related question. We have in our solution a number of different departments in our company, and there are a number of users in each department. And sometimes a user needs access to a field that the rest of the department doesn't need access to, and so then they need to have another a security group broken out for them. And then if everybody in that department then needs access to a new file, then we need to update 2 security groups. And additionally, we have the solution implemented to multiple different companies. And so then all of those security groups have to go back into the base. And I was wondering if you have looked into at all modularization of security profiles so that one user could be attached to a few different security groups, and so that they wouldn't all have to be updated field by field. Is there any movement towards that? Because it's very cumbersome for us to do that.
I guess that's the main reason for groups. You really should be setting up your roles and have your groups assigned to the privilege sets, because you can't really share a privilege set between 2 different files because the fields are different, the layouts are different, the scripts are different. There's no way you can say this person has access to script 14 and that mean anything to any other file and stuff like that. So
no, but I mean within the file. I'm just talking about one file. Mm-hmm. If you're to create a new privilege set every time one user in a privilege set needs access to a new file.
I guess what you want is hierarchical privilege sets. That really gets complex. I mean, when you start dealing with that, you almost like have no idea what permission someone is going to get unless you actually test it. When you start having hierarchical privilege sets, we try to keep it simpler. So we really try to encourage you to think up of instead of thinking of users, make sure you define your roles of different classes of people up front and keep the roles tight. Now, if for some reason this one user needs these other permissions, then you probably had an issue that, well, okay, you didn't think of a particular role that really should have existed all along. And you should go through and create different roles for each other. I mean, we can think about adding the hierarchical or fall through permissions, and you get the most permissive of the permissions of all the sets that you belong to, but we've really been hesitant to go that direction. So I really don't think we're going to go that way.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
I had a question about the data files, opening them up. Is there any chance you guys are going to add the ability to get modification and creation dates for files?
What do you mean by modification and creation dates?
He wants like a function to return the meta information about the file.
Oh, sure. That operating system.
Yeah, we only return file size now.
Right,
he wants things like modification date and.
Yeah, good feedback. Yeah, I mean, it's there. What do you?
It's doable. It's kind of like it falls into the line of the folder.
Yeah.
The future or potential future folder functions, but yeah, no, we could look into adding that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi. This isn't much of a very high-tech question, but as far as naming layouts, you can give it a pretty lengthy name. So why is that in browse mode, your layout drop-down menu is short with only like about 15 characters, and you can't view the entire name of the layout? And that toolbar is actually pretty empty. There's nothing else really on it, but just a short layout drop-down menu. Why is it so short? I think each year I kind of hope that it's going to be extended a bit, but.
Is this on Mac or Windows?
Windows is where I use it.
And Mac?
By short, you mean
character length?
Right.
Width, right?
Yeah, the
Correct.
width. Yeah, the layout.
Wider.
Yeah, the layout menu doesn't expand.
Shows about 15 characters, whereas FileMaker does allow you to name your layout, many characters,
Yeah, I mean that's great feedback. Again, we're just.
He's our Windows expert, so
So he's
we'll put him on the job right now.
Yeah.
So.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions?
All right. Guess with that, it's lunchtime.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks
All right,
everyone
thanks
for your time.
everyone.
So thank you for coming. Yeah.